This season, let your shoes do the talking. Designer Shoe Warehouse is packed with fresh styles that speak to your whole vibe without saying a word. From cool sneakers that look good with everything, to easy sandals you'll want to wear on repeat, DSW has you covered. Find a shoe for every you from the brands you love, like Birkenstock, Nike, Adidas, New Balance, and more. Head to your DSW store or visit dsw.com today.
This message comes from Capital One. The Capital One Venture X business card has no preset spending limit, so the card's purchasing power can adapt to meet business needs. Plus, the card earns unlimited double miles on every purchase, so the more a business spends, the more miles earned. And when traveling, the Venture X business card grants access to over 1,000 airport lounges. The Venture X business card. What's in your wallet? Terms and conditions apply. Find out more at CapitalOne.com/VentureXBusiness.
Hey everyone, Sebastian here. Before we get going today, I just wanted all of the listeners to know that today's episode of Our Fake History is going to feature some fairly frank discussions of sex and sexuality. We will also be touching on difficult topics like domestic violence and harm that comes to children. So if you're listening with younger listeners, or this is just not something you want to hear, then you may want to skip over this episode. For everyone else, I hope you enjoy the show. In the early morning hours of October 15th, 1917, a woman imprisoned in a small Parisian jail cell was shaken awake by two nuns. She had been awaiting execution for just over 2 months after she'd been found guilty in a French military court of espionage. The prosecutors had convinced a tribunal of 7 military judges that during the height of the First World War, this woman had been spying for the Germans. Further, it was suggested that the information that she had passed to the enemies of France may have resulted in the deaths of thousands of soldiers at the front lines. In 1917, the industrial carnage of the Great War was pushing French society to a breaking point. Before the war was over, an estimated 1.4 million French soldiers would die in the fighting. Millions more would sustain life-altering wounds. The trenches of the Western Front cut through French soil. The war was quite literally on their doorstep. It's hard to overstate just how much pressure was being felt by the average French citizen that year. Morale at the front lines was at an all-time low. In April of 1917, a large French offensive, which had been promoted as a war-winning maneuver, had cost thousands of lives and had done nothing to break the horrific stalemate that had characterized the war since 1914. The exhausted and thoroughly demoralized French soldiers started disobeying orders en masse. Sometimes called the Great Mutiny of 1917, huge numbers of French troops started to refuse orders to attack the enemy. Thousands of soldiers abandoned their posts. Many more chose to stay where they were and continued to repulse potential German advances, but refused to once again charge out of the trenches in attacks that seemed suicidal. Before order was restored at the front lines, thousands of men were court-martialed and hundreds were sentenced to die, although only 26 mutineers would ultimately be executed. All of this is to say that despite the recent declaration of war by the United States in 1917, the French war effort was feeling shaky. With hindsight, we know that an Allied victory was just 1 year away, but in 1917, that was hardly assured. It was in this environment that a Dutch national born Margaretha Zelle was apprehended by the French authorities. While most French citizens were not familiar with that particular name, most knew exactly who she was. About a decade earlier, Margaretha Zelle was one of the most famous women in Europe, but most only knew her by her stage name, Mata Hari. Starting in 1905, Mata Hari began performing what she claimed were Eastern temple dances that she had learned in her native Java, although the story sometimes changed depending on the audience. These dances were provocative, sexual, and involved the dancer becoming nearly nude on stage. Detractors called what she did lewd, while she defended her dances as authentic expressions of quote-unquote Oriental culture. She performed in theaters across the continent, was lauded by many critics, and often counted prominent military men, respected artists, and even European royals amongst her audiences. Mata Hari had been a turn-of-the-century sex symbol. Margaretha Zelle had created an elaborate new identity for herself, complete with an accompanying fake history. For a few years, she caught the imagination of curious Europeans, both fascinated and titillated by her nearly nude performances. But by the outbreak of World War I, her star had started to fade. Now, in 1917, she found herself standing in front of a firing squad, paying the ultimate price for allegedly passing French secrets to German liaisons. What had happened? How had she become embroiled in the high-stakes world of wartime espionage? On the morning of October the 17th, a British journalist named Henry Wales was in attendance as Mata Hari met her end. He wrote a description that was picked up by English-language newspapers around the world, courtesy of the International News Service. His piece was less than 900 words, but tellingly, he spent 125 of those words describing everything the woman wore in sumptuous detail. He wrote, quote, "Then she drew on her stockings, black, silken, filmy things, grotesque in the circumstances. She placed her high-heeled slippers on her feet and tied the silken ribbons over her instep. She arose and took the long, black velvet coat, edged around the bottom with fur, and with a huge square fur collar hanging down the back from a hook over the head of her bed. She placed this cloak over the heavy silk kimono which she had been wearing over her nightdress. Her wealth of black hair was still coiled about her head in braids. She put on a large, flapping black felt hat with a black silk ribbon and bow. Slowly and indifferently, it seemed, she pulled on a pair of black kid gloves." End quote. Even as she was being led to her death, the reporter couldn't help but comment on her fashion choices. He also lingers on the provocative articles of clothing, her black silk stockings getting extra attention. The whole thing has the feel of a tabloid piece. It's the kind of description that might turn up under the headline, "Exotic dancers spotted cavorting at Paris nightclub." Except, in this case, the woman in question was being hauled in front of a firing squad. There's a popular story that before her executioners took aim, Mata Hari waved to the nuns who kept her company during her imprisonment. Then she blew a kiss to her lawyer, who happened to be a former lover, and then blew a final kiss to the men holding the rifles trained on her body. A final defiant kiss fits perfectly with Mata Hari's image as a femme fatale, a woman who uses her feminine charms to manipulate men and deceive the unwitting. Of course, in her final moments, she would do something alluringly defiant. But not even journalist Henry Wales described these alleged goodbye kisses. And given the rest of Wales' writing, that's not the kind of detail he would have omitted if it had actually happened. No, instead, Wales described Mata Hari as facing her death with a resigned acceptance. Some might even call it bravery. According to Wales, she refused the customary blindfold given to the condemned. She didn't blow any kisses. Instead, she faced her executioners stoically and did not look away as the order was given to fire. How had it come to this? How had one of Europe's most beloved and gossiped about performers found herself condemned by a French military tribunal? For nearly 100 years, Mata Hari was remembered as one of the early 20th century's great villains. Her seductive performances and her dalliances with sex work were often pointed to as evidence of her low moral character. Indeed, the prosecutors at her trial would point to her career as a nearly nude dancer and her storied sexual history as evidence of the fact that she could not be trusted. She seemed to perfectly fit the stereotype of the evil seductress. After all, she had spent her life creating an elaborate fake identity. It wasn't hard for her accusers to portray her as naturally duplicitous, a born liar whose free sexuality made her dangerous. Mata Hari wasn't even her real name. As such, for most of the 20th century, Mata Hari was remembered as the femme fatale. While the femme fatale trope certainly predates the life of Margaretha Zelle, movies, plays, books, and countless other forms of media would turn Mata Hari into the archetypal femme fatale villain. Even Pat Shipman's 2007 biography of Mata Hari, which is one of the better books on her life, is titled Femme Fatale. But in recent years, the life of Margaretha Zelle has been reevaluated by historians. Historians like Mary W. Craig, Julia Key, Rosie White, and the aforementioned Pat Shipman have argued that Mata Hari has been saddled with a historical reputation that she does not deserve. In fact, many now believe that the charges of espionage brought against the Dutch dancer were trumped up and exaggerated by her accusers. Was Mata Hari really a seductive mastermind caught in her own web of lies? Or was she a convenient scapegoat used by the French authorities to draw attention away from problems at the battlefront? Let's see if we can figure it out today on Our Fake History. Episode number 173, Who Framed Mata Hari, Part 1. Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story it simply must be told. Before we get going today, I just want to remind everyone listening that an ad-free version of the show is available through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/OurFakeHistory and start supporting at $5 or more every month to get access to an ad-free feed and all the other extra content I have on offer. There's something new out now for patrons supporting at $3 or more. Our friend Daniele Bolelli, host of History on Fire, just did a little half-hour episode busting a historical myth for his patrons on Patreon. And because it reminded him so much of Our Fake History, and because he is just an awesome dude, he suggested that I share it with my patrons. It's an amazing story about a division of Japanese soldiers in World War II and what may have been the most deadly crocodile attack in history. It's a wild tale, and Daniele does an amazing job separating the fact from the fiction. So, patrons, check your feed for that. If you want in on that, go to patreon.com/OurFakeHistory. But for everyone else out there, I just want to remind you that History on Fire, Daniele Bolelli's exceptional history podcast, is once again available for free on all the podcast apps. Except, of course, this one episode about the crocodiles. To hear that, you got to be a patron of mine or a patron of Daniele's. But if you are not subscribed to the main feed for History on Fire, then do yourself a favor and get yourself subscribed. It's one of the best history podcasts in the game, so you gotta check it out. Today, we are beginning a new series on one of the most infamous and potentially misunderstood women of the early 20th century. I am speaking of the woman born Margaretha Zelle, who the world would come to know as Mata Hari. Mata Hari is one of those historical figures whose pop culture image has remained ubiquitous, despite the story of her life fading from popular memory. Almost immediately after she died, Mata Hari was transformed into a spy fiction stock character. The first movie about her life appeared in 1920, just 3 years after her execution. In 1931, her story became one of the best-grossing films of the Hollywood star Greta Garbo's career. Garbo's Mata Hari was actually one of the first talkies the former silent movie star had appeared in, and was considered an early triumph of movies with sound. Since then, there have been at least 5 other Mata Hari films and a handful of television series. She's been the subject of 5 stage musicals, the most ridiculously titled being Mata! Which ran in England in 1995. Oh man, I love that. Stage musicals will just add an exclamation mark to anything. Mata! As recently as 2021, in the Eurovision Song Competition, Enfede, the singer representing Azerbaijan, made it to one of the semi-final rounds with a song called Mata Hari. The lyrics go, quote, "I am a godless spy. I am a spy. I uncover all of your secrets. I want them. There's no stopping me now. I'm a liar. Playing the game of desire. Ain't gonna leave no survivors. Would you fall for me now? Just like Cleopatra, the army of lovers. I start a fire. Mata Hari." End quote. Now, I subjected you to that because I think it demonstrates just how vital the Mata Hari myth continues to be. In 2021, we have someone aspiring to international pop star fame telling the tale of Mata Hari. And indeed, Enfede's Mata Hari very much conforms to the femme fatale image that has persisted over the decades. If we trust our Eurovision contestant, then Mata Hari was a godless spy and a liar who used her sexuality to ensnare her victims. The lyrics also tell us that Mata Hari was just like Cleopatra. Now that struck me, because I think Enfede and her collaborators may have inadvertently struck on something quite perceptive here. I think it is true that Mata Hari and Cleopatra have a very similar historical reputation. Back in our Cleopatra series, I argued that the Egyptian queen had come by this scandalous reputation quite unfairly. The Roman writers who got to tell her story presented her as sexually immoral and the cause of the downfall of the Roman men who were seduced by her. Many historians now believe that this characterization has given us a skewed understanding of Cleopatra. At the time, I believe I referred to this as the, quote, lying sex witch trope. This is the idea that some powerful women use their bewitching sexuality to corrupt the men around them. The implication being, of course, that these women were only powerful because they were able to use their evil sex magic. This trope came up again when we were talking about Eleanor of Aquitaine. In fact, it comes up pretty much every time we talk about powerful women on this show. It's a predictable bit of historical slander that I've had to debunk so many times on this podcast that many of you can now see this coming a mile away. I know that there's one Our Fake History fan who actually made her Twitter handle @LyingSexWitch, which, hilarious. I love that you get it. I know that you're listening too, so shout out to Megan. Anyway, as our Azerbaijani Eurovision contestant has demonstrated, the lying sex witch trope continues to color how we remember Mata Hari. But what makes Mata Hari interesting is that she consciously played with this trope in her professional career. She purposefully constructed her own sex witch image, if you will. Now, here's what I mean by that. Her dancing career was built around the idea that she possessed a certain mystical sexuality. She claimed to be from Southeast Asia and presented her dances as sacred religious rites. The nudity in the performances was justified as simply being authentically Asian. The implication being that the only way to correctly channel the sacred power of the performance was by employing one's sexuality. She wanted people to perceive her as being able to connect with ancient mystical forces by way of her provocative dances. But as many Mata Hari biographers have pointed out, Mata Hari lost control of her public image near the end of her life. At her trial, the prosecutors would use her history as an exotic dancer, the fact that she created an elaborate professional alias, and the fact that she admittedly engaged in sex work as evidence of a duplicitous nature. Mata Hari biographer Mary Craig has argued that, quote, the belief that she was an enemy agent was based in part on her sexual behavior, end quote. The academic Rose White has argued that this tactic on the part of the prosecution was so successful because there was, quote, a lack of distinction between spying and prostitution in the public imagination, end quote. She points to the work of historian T.M. Proctor, who explained that, quote, the female spy blurred the distinction of public and private, as did the prostitute, by performing public work in private spaces, end quote. Put simply, Mata Hari's exotic, sexually alluring image was weaponized against her. But of course, the big question is whether or not she was truly guilty of the crimes that she was accused of. Was she really working for the Germans during the First World War? Had she passed along sensitive information that had led to the deaths of thousands of French troops? Was she a nefarious double agent playing both the French and German intelligence services? As you might have guessed, the answers to these questions are complicated. But most historians now believe that the case of Margaretha Zelle, aka Mata Hari, deserves to be reevaluated. Far from being the scheming femme fatale, it may be that Mata Hari was played by powerful men on both sides of the war. So, what should we believe about this exotic dancer turned spy? Well, let's start from the beginning. The life story of Mata Hari is riddled with legends. Many she created herself. So let's dig in. When Mata Hari launched her dancing career in 1905, she told all those who were curious that she had been born on the Indonesian island of Java, which at the time was still part of the Dutch colonial empire. In fact, all of what we call Indonesia today was at the time known as the Dutch East Indies. Her father, she said, had been a Hindu temple priest. It was there, as a child, that she learned her, quote, sacred temple dances that would become her hallmark. Sometimes, when she was feeling bold, she would even claim that she was a Javanese princess. But these were all just elaborate fictions invented as a performance gimmick. Now, you may have thought when you started this podcast that the life of Mata Hari was going to be a sexy romp through the world of espionage. But I have some bad news for you. Her early life was fairly harrowing, so just buckle up. Margaretha Zelle was born in the northern province of Friesland in the Netherlands in 1876. From an early age, many commented on her noticeably dark features, which were somewhat uncommon in the Netherlands at that time. She had brown eyes, dark brown hair, and a slightly darker skin tone than many of her Dutch contemporaries. She would later play this up and even enhance these features to better sell her image as a Javanese temple dancer. Some have speculated that she may have had Jewish heritage or Mediterranean ancestors. Both are possible, but most researchers have discovered that she was quite solidly Dutch and Christian on both parents' sides, going back for at least a few generations. She started life the eldest daughter in an upwardly mobile bourgeois Dutch family. Biographies that are less kind to Margaretha, or ones that approach her story from the perspective that she is a historical villain, often look to her childhood for the roots of her villainy. You will read that she was spoiled by her father, who bought her expensive gifts as a young girl. On her 6th birthday, she was gifted something called a goat carriage. It was basically a miniature high-class carriage built for children, pulled by 2 handsomely horned goats. This was such a fancy gift that the Zelle's neighbors would talk about it years later when they were interviewed by journalists looking for information on the young Mata Hari. The goat carriage often gets cited as evidence that Margaretha Zelle was set on a bad path at a young age. The implication is that because later in life she developed some expensive tastes, these can be traced back to her father's doting and the infamous goat carriage. But I think this kind of thinking should be resisted. It's a bit much to say that the goat carriage created Mata Hari. No. In fact, despite the somewhat idyllic nature of her very early days, Margaretha had an incredibly difficult upbringing. When she was 13 years old, her father went bankrupt as the result of some bad investments and then walked out on the family. 2 years later, her mother passed away. The stress of the separation and the family's sudden turn of fortunes no doubt contributing to her rapid decline in health. So, in the course of just 2 years, Margaretha essentially lost both of her parents. Yes, her father was still alive, but their relationship would remain strained for the rest of his life. After her mother's death, Margaretha was sent to live with her godfather and his wife in the small Dutch town of Sneek. Apparently, they found the teenager to be headstrong and difficult to control. Again, this can get presented as an early example of her bold personality and the type of character trait that would eventually lead to her doom. But to me, she sounds like a pretty typical teenager. Personally, I can't help but be sympathetic. Remember, she had just lost her mother and her father had walked out on the family. If anyone had the right to be angsty, it was young Margaretha Zelle. Her godparents eventually packed her off to a boarding school in Leiden that specialized in training young women to become kindergarten teachers. At the time, this school was at the cutting edge of early childhood education and was an early adopter of play-based learning for young children. If you're curious about this stuff, you can read about the Leiden method for early childhood education. Perhaps there's an alternate timeline where Mata Hari was a kindergarten teacher. But unfortunately, Margaretha did not last long at this school. Within a year, she had been dismissed from the institution under upsetting circumstances. The details are hazy, but something inappropriate happened between the 16-year-old Margaretha and the school's headmaster, a man named Vibrandus Hanstra. Now, in biographies written in the early 20th century, this story sometimes gets presented like it was Mata Hari's first seduction. It would get folded into her origin myth as an immoral and scandalous woman. But obviously, this is a completely backwards way to understand this situation. Mata Hari biographer Pat Shipman quite rightly points out that, quote, "Today, this behavior would be understood as the criminal exploitation of a minor. He was a mature man in a position of authority over children. She was a girl who had been placed in his care. But in 1893, she was considered the one without morals and disgraced." End quote. To add insult to injury, Hanstra's career was completely unaffected by this inappropriate relationship. It was the teenage Margaretha who bore all the consequences. She was kicked out of school, and even after she was dead, biographers would point to this moment as the start of her career as some sort of a seductress. It's upsetting enough that this happened to the young Margaretha, but it's completely unfair that it's been used to further sully her historical reputation. After her dismissal from school, Margaretha was shuffled off to a different pair of relatives, this time in the large Dutch city of The Hague. She would live there for just over 2 years until 1895. In that year, she answered a personal ad in a local paper that said simply, quote, "Officer on home leave from Dutch East Indies would like to meet a girl of pleasant character. Object, matrimony." End quote. This is how she would meet the acquaintance of Rudolf MacLeod, a captain in the Dutch colonial army, 20 years her senior. The ad had been placed half-jokingly by one of Rudolph's army friends, but as he was in line for promotion, he saw the utility of having a nice Dutch wife. Apparently, married men were considered better material for promotion in those days. MacLeod was descended from the Scottish aristocratic clan MacLeod, hence the distinctively Scottish last name. But he had been born and bred in the Netherlands. For her part, Margaretha was seeking independence from her relatives. A life of international adventure with a colonial army captain seemed somewhat appealing, at least at first. After a very quick 2-month courtship, the two were married in June of 1895, just before Margaretha's 19th birthday. Less than 2 years later, they welcomed their first son, Norman John, before the entire family shipped off to the Dutch East Indies as part of MacLeod's redeployment. The family would live in a number of different places around what we today call Indonesia, but a good part of their stay was spent in the town of Tumang in East Java. Now, this time in Java would prove to be incredibly significant when Margaretha reinvented herself as Mata Hari. But the nearly 5 years that Margaretha lived in the Dutch East Indies from 1897 to 1902 were truly miserable years. Her impulsive marriage to Rudolf MacLeod ended up being nothing less than a disaster. Margaretha's letters back to friends and family in the Netherlands would present her husband as a physically and emotionally abusive alcoholic. Despite that, the couple would welcome a second child, their daughter Louise Jean, in May of 1898. Nicknamed Non, a shortening of the Javanese word nona that meant little miss, the birth of their daughter would be one of the only bright spots in their tumultuous 5 years away from Europe. Their relationship steadily declined, with MacLeod becoming more openly abusive as the years went on. As their relationship came apart, Rudolf would accuse his wife of carrying on a huge number of illicit affairs with other Dutch military men. Biographer Pat Shipman has made the case that Margaretha was admired by many men in the Dutch East Indies, and she made no apologies for enjoying that attention. Shipman has also shown that there is evidence that she had extramarital affairs during her years in Indonesia, but hardly to the extent that her jealous husband would later accuse her of. The hypocrisy of all this was massive, considering that, according to Shipman and biographer Mary Craig, Rudolf MacLeod kept an Indonesian woman as a mistress and had many extramarital affairs of his own. Then things went from bad to worse. In 1899, the couple's first child, their son Norman John, tragically passed away. At the time, there was a story put out that Norman had been poisoned by a vengeful Indonesian servant who had somehow been wronged by Rudolf MacLeod. But most Matahari experts now think that that was just a dark cover story. Both Pat Shipman and Mary Craig believe that little Norman actually died while being treated for congenital syphilis. Pat Shipman, in particular, has made a very strong case that Rudolf MacLeod likely contracted the disease as a young officer in the Dutch East Indies before the couple were married. Then he passed it on to his wife and children. Now, to be clear, the death of Norman is still a bit of a mystery, but as Pat Shipman elaborately details in her book, Matahari's letters, Rudolf MacLeod's medical history, and their daughter's later medical troubles all make syphilis the most likely cause of death in this case. Either way, to make up a story about someone murdering your child and for that to be the respectable cover story, yikes. The specifics of Margaretha's medical history are somewhat unclear, but biographer Mary Craig has shown that there is evidence that she continued to be treated for syphilis throughout her life. As I'm sure you can imagine, the loss of Norman did nothing to improve the MacLeod's marriage. By all accounts, Rudolf became even more abusive. In 1902, Margaretha finally returned to the Netherlands. Her estranged husband and daughter followed soon afterwards. Back in Europe, she was granted a legal separation from her husband after successfully arguing in court that he had treated her violently. But it was on this return that Margaretha likely turned to sex work for the first time in her life. Quite simply, she was desperate for money. The court-ordered payments from Rudolf could barely sustain her, so she did what she had to do to survive. Unfortunately, Rudolf had her tailed by private investigators in hopes of digging up exactly this kind of dirt that he could then weaponize as part of their ongoing custody disputes over their surviving daughter. He eventually let her know in a letter that he had this evidence. And so Margaretha was compelled to return to Rudolf out of fear that she would never see her daughter again. But this apparent reconciliation was short-lived. Now, of course, to call it a reconciliation is actually completely ridiculous. But the manipulative Rudolf would frame it that way in front of the courts. In a matter of months, Margaretha would leave for good. But now, Rudolph could present the situation like she was a runaway wife with a history of sex work, and this ensured that he would retain custody of their daughter for the rest of her childhood. Whew. How's that for a harrowing journey so far? To throw my biases on the table, I can't help but have sympathy for Margaretha Zelle MacLeod. All of this happened before she was even out of her 20s. But her story does not end there. You see, Margaretha was nothing if not a survivor. She would start a new life in Paris, and while the separation from her daughter was deeply painful, the distance from Rudolph was liberating. Soon, she would be reborn as a completely new person. The troubled life of Margaretha Zelle MacLeod would fade into obscurity. She would create a new life as the Javanese princess Mata Hari. And against all odds, within a few years, she was being toasted as one of Europe's great entertainers. How did she do it? Well, let's take a quick break, and when we return, we will witness the birth of Mata Hari. Margaretha's first couple of years in Paris were far from glamorous. She came to the city without much of a plan. Years later, a journalist asked her why she chose to settle in the French capital, and she replied, quote, "I don't know. I thought all women who ran away from their husbands went to Paris," end quote. In her first couple years in Paris, which included a few returns to the Netherlands, she tried all sorts of things to make money. She worked as an artist's model. She got a few acting gigs in cheap theaters. But as biographer Pat Shipman points out, quote, "The only dependable source of income for her was pleasing men for money," end quote. But in 1904, she managed to get a gig as a trick rider in a small Parisian circus. In her years as a military man's wife, she had learned how to ride a horse, and indeed would remain an avid rider for the parts of her life when she could afford to do so. She was clearly competent enough that she could perform on horseback in a circus. But the circus owner, one Ernst Mollier, soon advised his striking-looking trick rider that her career as an entertainer might be better served if she took up dance. Small dance performances in chic lounges and private homes hosted by Parisian socialites were all the rage around the turn of the century. If Margaretha could get together a dance performance, Mollier could make some introductions, and then she might be able to get some contacts among Parisian high society. Margaretha took the assignment seriously. Now, she was not a trained dancer. She was a total amateur. But she clearly knew how to create a gimmick. While she'd been living in Java, she'd been exposed to traditional Javanese dance. The women who worked as nannies in her household all had danced. It was common for Margaretha to watch these women practicing traditional dances in free moments. Now, you might sometimes read that Margaretha studied Javanese dance while she was in Indonesia, but that seems to be an exaggeration. She watched some Javanese dance, and at most, according to biographer Mary Craig, she, quote, possibly participated a little, end quote. But there's no evidence that she was properly taught any dancing techniques in Indonesia. And she was certainly not part of any dance troupe in Java, as you might sometimes read. But Margaretha had absorbed just enough that in her first proper foray into dancing, she felt like she could provide enough of a facsimile of Javanese dance that she could fool a European audience. It would turn out that she was totally correct. Now, at this point, I have to point out that another weird theme has emerged in Season 8 of this podcast. In the last series, I mentioned how the Jesuits had become recurring characters this season. Well, if we have another theme, then I guess it's pretending to be Asian, because that's exactly what Margaretha Zelle did. Now, Zelle was tapping into a larger fad that was sweeping Europe. Around the turn of the century, Orientalism was in. As we talked about before on this podcast, that term, Orientalism, was later taken by the historian Edward Said and used in his influential critique of stereotypes about Asia that had long been perpetuated in European art, literature, and discourse. At the turn of the century, this stereotypical view of the quote-unquote Orient, which had existed for centuries, was having a moment of real popularity. European fashion, home decor, the art scene, and entertainment of all sorts was being influenced by this trend. The trend, of course, being a skewed understanding of the many cultures of Asia. You might remember from the Houdini series that many magicians of this era used Oriental gimmicks or straight up pretended to be Turkish or Chinese in their acts. Margaretha jumped on this trend just as it was gaining steam. The other key element of Margaretha's dancing was that it was erotic. She removed layers of clothing until she was nearly nude on stage. Now, despite what you may read, technically, she never became entirely naked on stage. She would strip, but she always kept on an elaborately jeweled brassiere. She also always wore a skin-toned body stocking. This gave the illusion that she was mostly naked on stage, but technically, she was wearing some clothes at the end of her performances. Now, you'll also sometimes hear that Mata Hari invented the striptease or erotic dancing. This is ridiculous. As I'm sure many of you could guess, erotic dancing is as old as dancing itself. Burlesque dancing had been a popular, if somewhat sneered at, form of entertainment in Europe dating to the 18th century. Paris was well known for its can-can dancers. This was the heyday of the Moulin Rouge, after all. The amount of clothes removed in these performances depended on the context. The point is that Margaretha Zelle wasn't the only person performing titillating dances in Paris in 1905. But her clever spin on the whole thing was that her dances were presented as sacred religious rites. At first, she billed herself as Lady MacLeod and concocted a backstory that borrowed elements from her own life. She claimed to be from Java, where she had been taken as a wife by a Dutch army officer with a Scottish last name. The dances she was performing were presented as authentic Hindu temple dances from her home island. The sexuality of the performance was given an air of respectability because it was understood as a cultural encounter with religious significance. Of course, this was a total fiction. Margaretha's act was very clearly an obvious case of cultural appropriation. Except she wasn't even appropriating all that much. The elements she borrowed from Javanese dance were quite minimal. She actually didn't know much about Javanese dance. Instead, her dance was a pastiche of stereotypes about the Hindu religion. It was then all topped off with the seductive removing of clothes. But what is remarkable is how enthusiastically she was received as soon as she debuted her new act. The circus owner, Mollier, used his connections to get Lady MacLeod her first show performing in a private home of a well-known social hostess named Madame Kirivsky. The audience was small, but influential. The hostess invited artists, writers, and other tastemakers to the event. One of the attendants was a correspondent for a London society magazine called The King, and he wrote a rave review of the performance. Lady MacLeod had performed that night in front of a statue of the Hindu god Shiva, a prop that would become an important part of many of her early performances. The English writer was entranced. He wrote, quote, "Vague rumors had reached me of a woman from the Far East, a native of Java, wife of an officer who had come to Europe, laden with perfumes and jewels, to introduce some of the richness of the Orient, color and life into the satiated European cities, of veils encircling and discarded, of the development of passion, of the fruits of the soil, a burst of fresh, free life of nature in all its strength, untrammeled by civilization." End quote. He would go on to describe the dancer's, quote, olive skin and, quote, Eastern headdress and breastplate of similar workmanship, end quote. The review would go on to breathlessly praise the dance as a primal and moving religious rite. At the climax, he wrote, quote, "The movement became more intense, more feverish, more eager. She first threw flowers and then divested herself one by one of the veils, implying that as a sacrifice she gave youth, beauty, love, and finally worked to a state of frenzy. She unclasped her belt and fell in a swoon at Shiva's feet." End quote. The writer would conclude, quote, "Lady MacLeod is Venus," end quote. If that review is any indication, the shtick worked exactly as intended. All she had to do was hint at the quote-unquote mysteries of the Orient, and that thirsty writer just took it from there. Now, clearly, he wasn't the only one impressed by this performance, because very quickly, Lady MacLeod became the talk of Paris. Just over a month after this initial performance in a private salon, Lady MacLeod was invited to bring her act to the Guimet Museum. At the time, this was the largest museum of Asian art and culture in all of Paris. The collection was eventually deemed to be so significant that it was acquired by the French government. Now, the fact that Margaretha was asked to perform at a museum gives you a strong indication of how her act was received. It wasn't slotted alongside the entertainment offered in places like the Moulin Rouge. This had the veneer of high culture. Of course, Lady MacLeod leaned into this perception. In a later interview, she would describe her performances like this, quote, "My dance is a sacred poem in which each movement is a word, and whose every word is underlined by music. The temple in which I dance can be vague or faithfully reproduced, for I am the temple. All temple dances are religious in nature." End quote. But even though her performances were sold as deeply authentic experiences, there is some evidence that early on, many understood that the whole thing was an elaborate construction. For instance, the proprietor of the Guimet Museum, Émile Guimet, suggested that she might consider a name change before her first performance at his museum. The robustly Scottish-sounding moniker Lady MacLeod didn't really evoke the Far East. Margaretha agreed. So before her debut at the museum, She redubbed herself Mata Hari. Sometimes Guimé is given credit for inventing the name, but this is unlikely, as the phrase Mata Hari is one that Margaretha undoubtedly heard while she was in the Dutch East Indies. It's a Malaysian phrase that's used to refer to the sun or the sunrise. Mata Hari literally translates as eye of the day. The name was perfect for the act, and it would stick. In March of 1905, Mata Hari would perform a number of sold-out and rapturously received performances at the Guimé Museum. It might be an exaggeration to say that she became an overnight celebrity, but by the end of the year, she was one of the most talked-about entertainers in Paris. By 1906, she would be comfortably touring all of Europe. Her performance was tailor-made to get press. It was deeply sexual, but remained respectable because of Mata Hari's faux religious pretensions. It tapped perfectly into the Oriental fashion craze, and in many ways gave the trend a boost. She was the right thing at the right time. After 1905, the troubled past of Margaretha Zelle MacLeod was allowed to fade into the darkness. All that was left now was the eye of the day. She would now and forever be Mata Hari. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time when we will continue our look at Mata Hari. Before I go this week, I need to give a shout out to the following people. Big ups to Wyatt Burnt, to Elizabeth Warren Moon, to David, to Anukamla Flores, to Jackson Womack, to Bob Coopens, to Brendan Grant, to Yannick Massey, to Juan Shute, to Joshua B., to Cody Kirkland, to David Agnew, and to Mark Susi. All of these people have decided to pledge at $5 or more every month on Patreon, so you know what that means. They are beautiful human beings. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you to people supporting at all levels on Patreon. Thanks to people giving one-off donations at the website. That's ourfakehistory.com. Thank you to everyone writing nice 5-star reviews. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/ourfakehistory. You can find me on Instagram at ourfakehistory. And you can find me on Twitter at ourfakehistory. As always, the theme music for the show comes to us from Dirty Church. You can check out Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. All the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.